King Richard III, on the 22nd of August, 1485, rode into battle on his white courser horse, and he had with him an army of around 8,000 soldiers. But on that day it would be the final time that a king of England would fall in battle. The Battle of Bosworth Field saw the Tudor era begin as King Henry VII, or Henry Tudor, defeated Richard's forces, despite being outnumbered. However, Richard III came onto the throne himself under very disturbing and mysterious circumstances. He was a king who many believed was a usurper, but most commonly today, Richard III is referred to as the king found under the car park, as the historical discovery of the century was made inside of the city of Leicester. But today the brutal and barbaric manner of Richard III's death can be told due to the injuries found on his body. But what is the story of the death of King Richard III? Richard III was crowned king on the 6th of July 1483 inside of Westminster Abbey, and the Wars of the Roses had for decades gripped England. He was a king who had publicly denounced the princes in the Tower, his nephews, of whom one, King Edward V, was the rightful king of England. The two boys, Edward V and his brother Richard, were held inside of the Tower of London, awaiting the coronation, when they disappeared, and many believed that Richard III, who seized the throne, was responsible for their murder and disappearances. But Henry Tudor, or Henry VII as he was later known, would meet Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field 2 years later, as he would spearhead the House of Lancaster's attempt to seize the throne. The Battle of Bosworth Field erupted on the 22nd of August 1485, and the armies of Lancaster and York met in Leicestershire. Richard had a large army made up of 8,000 soldiers, and Henry Tudor's army was sitting on a hill opposite. Spectating was the army of Lord Stanley, who had 6,000 men, and he was the key player in the battle, as his support meant everything, and it was his intervention that swayed the battle. The battle was decided when Lord Stanley's army got involved to support Henry Tudor, that surprised Richard and his soldiers. During the final part of the battle, it was recorded that Richard had Henry Tudor trapped and isolated, and the royalist army were fighting in the thickest of presses, and the king's men wanted victory and they smelt it. Richard was concerned about the betrayal of Stanley, and he knew that Henry Tudor was a number of bodyguards behind his soldier, and Richard, a brave and skilled military leader, rode to try and bring the battle to an end quickly by killing Henry VII. Richard smashed his way through the guards of Henry Tudor, and he killed his standard-bearer, and there was a hand-to-hand fight, and Henry's bodyguards were defending the Tudors as much as they could. But Richard fought bravely and valiantly, and he came within a sword's length of Henry. But Richard found himself then overwhelmed by the mercenary soldiers of Lord Stanley. Richard III found himself in marshy and boggy ground, and his horse got stuck in the terrain, and he then fell off of his horse. It was then wrote how Richard's horse leapt into the marsh and he could not get out, but then it was stated that the death blows were struck by a Welshman with a halberd while Richard's horse was stuck, and it was said that the blow was so violent that the king's helmet was driven into his skull. The man who killed Richard has been suggested to have been Rhys ap Thomas, a leading Welsh Lancastrian who shaved part of the king's head with a blow when he struck him. The official historian of Henry VII wrote how bravely Richard fought, and it was said he fell in the field struck by many mortal wounds, and they beat his head until his brain came out with blood. They never left him until he was dead. But the brutality of Richard III's final moments were confirmed and documented when his remains were found inside of a car park in Leicester in 2013. The wounds of his body stated that Richard's death was brutal, and 11 wounds were visible on his skeleton, and 8 of these were to the skull. These had been sustained in battle, and it shows that Richard lost his helmet during the final moments of this battle, and a frenzied attack was launched upon the king, as confirmed in the historical documents. There was more than just one person who piled on the king, and he came under pressure. But there was a V-shape cut found along the bottom of the lower jaw, and his face was cut by a dagger or a knife. There was also another cut to his lower jaw. Notably, Richard III's body was well protected when he died due to his armour, and there was little damage or injury to his torso, and he must have been wearing this when he died. There was also wounds on the left side above his ear and on top of his skull, and one of these wounds was fatal. There were 3 glancing blows which were caused by a sharp-bladed weapon, such as a pole axe or a sword. However, on top of the skull was a small piercing hole caused by a dagger, which had been driven into Richard's skull, causing brain damage. But at the base of the skull was a huge wound that showed a weapon had struck the side of his head and had damage to the top vertebra, and this blade had shattered his neck and had sliced through the brain, and this was done incredibly hard. It was likely that this was the fatal blow. But all this evidence allowed historians to piece together the final moments of Richard III's life. Richard had been unhorsed, with his horse being stuck in the mud. He was forced to dismount, and during this he may have removed his helmet or lost this, leaving him vulnerable. But then he was surrounded by many skilled soldiers, armed with weapons such as swords and poleaxes. He was protected by his own men, but Lord Stanley's men waded in and then quickly overwhelmed the king as he was attacked by soldiers who thrust swords and daggers at him. However, a brutal and huge blow from the poleaxe, bill or harbeld smashed into Richard III's head and stopped him. This is what would have killed him, bringing the start of the Tudor dynasty. But Richard III's face was left untouched to an extent following the battle, so that his body could be taken into Leicester, so that the people could see the remains of their king and confirm that he had been killed. Richard's armour was taken off, and his naked body was displayed in public for 2 days, and it was then placed in a plain coffin and was buried inside of the unremarkable church. It then lay there for centuries until 2013, and using modern science and equipment, the remains of Richard III were found, and this was then proven by using DNA testing, putting beyond any doubt that Richard III had been buried inside of the Church of the Greyfriars. After the death of King Richard III, the most notorious and brutal dynasty that ruled over England, the Tudors, came onto the throne. It was the ruling family that saw Henry VIII execute 2 of his own wives, and saw Elizabeth I order the execution of another anointed queen. However, Richard III was the last king of England slaughtered on the battlefield, and despite many considering him to have been a tyrant who usurped the throne, Richard in his final moments fought valiantly, despite the fact he was overwhelmed and battered. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.